They're following a script. It's a very old script. It's a script that goes back to ancient Rome. Pastor Martin Niemöller's famous poem begins with, "First they came for the socialists, but I was not a socialist, so I did not speak out." But in fact, first they came for the queer people, specifically the trans people. A year after the Nazis began attacking a year before Nazis began attacking union leaders and socialists, a full 5 years before Kristallnacht, when they were attacking Jewish-owned stores, the Nazis came for the trans people at the Institute for Sexual Research in Berlin. In 1930, this is 3 years before the Nazis, the Institute had pioneered the first gender-affirming surgery in modern Europe. Its director, Magnus Hirschfeld, had compiled the largest library of books and scientific papers on the LGBTQ spectrum in the world and was internationally recognized in the field of sexual and gender studies. Being gay, lesbian, or trans was tolerated in Germany and, at least in the big cities, when Hitler came to power on January 30th of 1933. But the German queer community was his first explicit target. Literally within weeks of Hitler coming to power, he began a campaign to demonize queer people, with especially vitriolic attacks on trans people across German media. German states put into law bans on gender-affirming care, drag shows, and any sort of, quote, public display of deviance, end quote. They were enforcing a law, it was called Paragraph 175, that had been put into place in 1871, that hadn't been enforced in Germany for decades. Certainly not in the 20th century. But here we are, a mere 5 months after Hitler came to power. On May 6, 1933, Nazis showed up at the Institute and hauled over 20,000 priceless, many of them priceless, books and manuscripts. This was the largest collection of literature, scientific and otherwise, on gender studies, and particularly on LGBTQ studies, in the world. Hauled them out into the street and created a bonfire you could see from half of Berlin. This was the first major Nazi book burning. It would, and they celebrated it with newsreels. They, the cameras showed up. They played newsreels in the theaters all across Germany before the movies. But it would not be the last book burning. The party's leaders said that by burning these books and literature about gays, lesbians, and trans people that dated back centuries in some cases, some even millennia, they were consigning to the flames, quote, the intellectual garbage of the past, and were, quote, protecting Germany's youth from deviance. Fascists always start by declaring themselves the victims of others. Victimhood is essential to the fascist worldview. It's at its core. It's their excuse for destroying other people's lives. They then cast the weakest and least popular minorities in a society as the victims, the victimizers of the fascists. Fascism is never directed against the rich and powerful. It's always against those least able to defend themselves. It's basically bullying turned into a political movement. And when fascists throughout history have looked for victims, they always begin with queer people, because that is the smallest minority. It's the minority that has the smallest circle of people compared to religious minorities or racial minorities, has the smallest circle of people who personally know them and therefore are willing to accept them, stand up for them, defend them, and speak out against their persecution. Once the fascists have shattered the LGBTQ people and turn the country against them, then they move on to demonizing and politically disenfranchising racial minorities and religious minorities. Then they suppress the rights of women, celebrate masculinity and guns, seize major political parties and the courts, and then take over the nation itself. This formula goes all the way back to Rome. In 326, the year 326, Constantine the Great, who converted Rome to Christianity, put into place the death penalty for homosexuality. This was, Mussolini invented the word fascism in the 1920s, but it has been around for a long, long time. He simply put a label on it. Yesterday, Kevin McCarthy tried to federally one-up Ron DeSantis in their queer-hating fascist meter. It used to be, or it was, all these anti-gay, anti-trans, anti-lesbian laws were state-based. Yesterday, Kevin McCarthy introduced the first federal one. He called it a parental bill of rights. In Texas and Florida today, state authorities are coming for the parents of trans kids. Red states that have been seized by fascist demagogues are purging libraries and schools of books, banning drag shows, and outlawing women's rights to abortions and contraception. Fascists always weaponize sexuality, race, and religion. But it usually begins with sexuality and gender. The ACLU right now is tracking 371 anti-trans bills across the United States. Every single one was introduced by Republicans. Most of them include draconian criminal penalties. Most are promoted as, quote, protecting our children. That would be the same children who die by bullets every 2 hours and 26 minutes every day in America and are injured by bullets every 10 to 15 minutes in America. But there's no laws to regulate bullets or guns. Fascists love guns. Displaying weapons in public makes them feel more masculine, more powerful, less frightened. They're wielding the ultimate power, the power over life and death. After Florida passed their Don't Say Gay or Trans law, Human Rights Watch reported a 400% surge in social media hate speech directed at queer people nationwide. What starts in Florida does not stay in Florida. The FBI released a report in 2021 showing a shocking 7-fold increase in hate crimes against lesbians. Next year, I guarantee you, you're going to see the same thing against trans people, when they look back on this year's statistics. Suicide among queer youth is exploding, with 45% reporting last year that they'd considered suicide. The Republicans know this, but they don't care. They're reveling in this current fascist climate. Every new law brings a couple of more bigots to vote for them. They are doing things that were unimaginable just a decade ago. Republican or Republican-associated fascists have tried to murder the governor of Michigan, the vice president of the United States, the Speaker of the House. They've sent dozens of bombs to high-profile Democratic politicians. They've killed multiple police officers and civilians in several states, as well as on January 6th. They've infiltrated the FBI and police agencies across the country. The largest slaughter of American Jews in modern history came right after Donald Trump said, quote, Hillary Clinton meets in secret with international banks to plot the destruction of U.S. sovereignty in order to enrich these global interest powers, her special interest friends and her donors. And when they talk about globalist bankers, who they're talking about. You don't even need a Nazi decoder ring to figure that one out. Now, in the Wisconsin Supreme Court race, the Republicans are running ads saying that the progressive in that race is being funded by George Soros and the international Jews. They don't use the word Jews. It's an international conspiracy, though. Yeah, I mean, again, everybody knows what this dog whistle means. We just learned this week, literally this week, that another American fascist was planning to murder Michigan's openly lesbian Attorney General, Dana Nessel. 5 people in a fascist group from Fresno were arrested this week for 7 terrorist bombings. Meanwhile, the hottest topic among Republicans is a new civil war. Republican-controlled states across the nation are aggressively purging black voters from their rolls. Literally tens of millions of them in the last 10, 15 years. In Florida and Texas, the governors of those states have had black ex-felons arrested and paraded in front of cameras. Billboards go up all across the country before every election saying voter fraud is a felony. Fascists, after all, think of democracy as old-fashioned and quaint, something to give lip service to, but not to seriously practice. Meanwhile, Donald Trump proposed this week his own legislation outlawing trans people altogether. This is accelerating. In Florida, Channel 8 reports Florida Senator Jason Broder wants bloggers who write about Governor Ron DeSantis and other members of the Florida Executive Cabinet or Legislature to register with the state or face fines. These are not isolated incidents. They are not separate from one another. They are part of a whole, and we all have to speak up. We have to call this what it is. It is fascism. And if we don't wake up and speak out, we may not have a recognizable America in 2 or 3 years.